Imagine ruling the largest empire on Earth, 1/6 of the world's land, 130 million subjects, and a dynasty 3 centuries old. Now imagine losing it all: power, family, and your life. This is the true story of Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia. Nicholas inherited an empire on the brink of change, but clung to outdated traditions. He was a loving father, but as a ruler, he was tragically unprepared. His virtues, gentleness, loyalty, faith, became public failings. His devotion to his wife blinded him to her disastrous influence. His belief in divine right made compromise impossible. We'll explore the pivotal moments of his reign: war, revolution, and the strange figure of Rasputin. This is how one Tsar lost an empire and changed the course of the 20th century. Nicholas Romanov, the future Nicholas II, was never truly prepared to rule the vast Russian Empire. From a young age, he was groomed for the throne in name only, shielded from the harsh realities and immense responsibilities that awaited him. His father, Alexander III, was a towering, forceful figure who saw Nicholas as weak and unready. Rather than training his son in the art of governance, Alexander kept him at arm's length from real power, believing that sheltering Nicholas would somehow make him stronger. Nicholas's education was limited to the rituals and etiquette of court life. He learned how to host grand balls and navigate the intricacies of aristocratic society, but he was never taught how to manage the complexities of a vast, troubled nation teetering on the brink of change. When Alexander died suddenly in 1894, the weight of the crown fell heavily on Nicholas's shoulders. Overwhelmed, he confessed to a close confidant, "I am not prepared to be a Tsar." His uncertainty was palpable, and the world could sense it. At that time, Russia was a land of deep contradictions. Millions of peasants toiled in poverty, bound to the land, while cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg rapidly industrialized, drawing in workers who faced harsh conditions and little hope for advancement. Social tensions soared across the empire. Peasants longed for land and freedom. Workers demanded fair wages and better conditions, and a new class of intellectuals called for sweeping reforms. The old order was being challenged from every direction. Yet Nicholas saw this growing unrest as the work of agitators and troublemakers. He convinced himself that deep down his people loved him unconditionally and that loyalty to the Tsar would never waver. Clinging to the traditions of autocracy, Nicholas refused to adapt or compromise. Even as Russia hurtled toward an uncertain future, he surrounded himself with loyalists and ignored the warning signs all around him. From the very start, Nicholas looked backward, longing for the stability of the past rather than embracing the changes his country so desperately needed. This fundamental misunderstanding of his people and the times he lived in would ultimately be his undoing, setting the stage for tragedy. Nicholas's reign began with a nation already on the edge, vast, restless, and full of potential, but also simmering with discontent. He was a man out of time, leading a country desperate for change, yet unable to see the storm that was about to break. Nicholas's first major test was the disastrous Russo-Japanese War. Confident in Russian might, he sought a quick victory to quell unrest, but underestimated Japan's modern military. Russia suffered humiliating defeats. Port Arthur fell, the army was routed at Mukden, and the Baltic fleet was destroyed at Tsushima. The myth of Russian invincibility was shattered. The war exposed corruption and incompetence at every level. Soldiers returned home angry and radicalized. The defeat drained the treasury and fueled revolutionary fires. The autocracy was now seen as not just oppressive, but dangerously inept. The war didn't cause revolution, but it pushed Russia closer to the abyss. At home, tensions exploded on Bloody Sunday, January 1905. Thousands of peaceful workers marched to the Winter Palace, hoping the Tsar would hear their pleas for better conditions. Nicholas wasn't there. Troops panicked and opened fire, killing hundreds. The sacred bond between Tsar and people was shattered. Outrage swept the empire. Strikes, uprisings, and mutinies erupted. For the first time, workers, peasants, soldiers, and liberals united in anger. Nicholas, terrified and indecisive, reluctantly issued the October Manifesto, granting basic civil liberties and creating the Duma. For a moment, constitutional monarchy seemed possible, but Nicholas never accepted real change. He saw the Duma as a threat and spent years undermining it. The lesson of Bloody Sunday was lost on him. The monarchy's legitimacy was fatally wounded. Russia's path to revolution was set. After 1905, a new figure haunted the imperial court, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin, a mystic peasant, gained influence by seemingly healing the Tsar's hemophiliac son, Alexei. Empress Alexandra saw him as a savior and gave him unprecedented access. Nicholas, deferring to his wife, allowed Rasputin's influence to grow. Rasputin's scandals and rumored debauchery became public, damaging the monarchy's reputation. He was seen as a puppet master, controlling the Tsar and Tsarina. During World War I, Alexandra relied on Rasputin for political advice, dismissing competent ministers for his cronies. The government descended into chaos, paralyzed by incompetence. Rasputin became a symbol of the regime's decay. The monarchy's image was irreparably tarnished. In 1914, World War I erupted, briefly uniting Russia behind the Tsar, but the army was ill-equipped and poorly led, defeats mounted, and millions died. Nicholas made a fatal error. He took personal command of the army, tying the monarchy to every failure. Meanwhile, Alexandra and Rasputin ran the government, alienating even loyal supporters. The war strained the economy, caused food shortages, and deepened public despair. The government collapsed into chaos. The monarchy's last supporters abandoned it. The war didn't cause the revolution, but it made it inevitable. Nicholas's leadership was now synonymous with disaster. Russia was ready to explode. The final blow was near. By early 1917, Russia was collapsing, its cities gripped by hunger, fear, and uncertainty. The strain of World War I had pushed the nation to the brink, with millions of soldiers lost and the economy in ruins. Ordinary Russians faced food shortages, skyrocketing prices, and a government that seemed indifferent to their suffering. Riots, strikes, and mutinies swept the cities. In Petrograd, desperate crowds lined up for bread, while workers abandoned their factories and took to the streets, demanding change. The unrest quickly spread, paralyzing the capital and shaking the foundations of the monarchy. The army, exhausted and demoralized, refused to fire on protesters. Instead, entire regiments began to join the revolution, siding with the people against the Tsar. The loyalty that had once protected the throne was gone. The Duma, Russia's parliament, seized the moment. They formed a provisional government as Nicholas lost all control, hoping to restore order and guide the country toward a new future. Trapped and powerless, Nicholas was urged to abdicate by his own generals and ministers. Isolated from reality and abandoned by his closest advisors, he faced the collapse of everything he had known. On March 2, 1917, Nicholas signed the abdication, ending more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The once mighty dynasty was brought down in a single moment, its fate sealed by the will of the people and the chaos of revolution. Nicholas and his family became prisoners, first at their palace in Tsarskoye Selo, then exiled to the remote town of Tobolsk in Siberia, and finally transported to Yekaterinburg. Their world shrank to a few guarded rooms, watched day and night by armed guards. As civil war raged across Russia, the Bolsheviks saw the Romanovs as a dangerous symbol, a rallying point for their enemies. Their presence threatened the fragile new order. In July 1918, in the basement of the Ipatiev house, Nicholas, Alexandra, their children, and loyal servants were executed by Bolshevik guards. The act was swift and brutal, meant to erase the past and prevent any hope of restoration. The dynasty was wiped out, the empire was gone. The symbols of Romanov power, crowns, palaces, and traditions were destroyed or abandoned, lost to history. Russia's old order was finished. The world watched as centuries of imperial rule vanished almost overnight, replaced by uncertainty and fear. The revolution had claimed its ultimate victims. The aristocracy mourned, and the Russian people faced an uncertain future, forever changed by the events of 1917 and 1918. A new, more ruthless era had begun. The Bolsheviks seized power, determined to reshape Russia in their image, no matter the cost. The execution of the Romanov family in the basement of the Ipatiev house marked not just the end of a royal dynasty, but the violent closing of an entire chapter in Russian history. Their deaths sent shockwaves through the world, symbolizing the collapse of centuries-old traditions and the brutal birth of something entirely new. In the aftermath, hopes for democracy and reform that had flickered during the revolution were quickly extinguished. Instead, Russia was plunged into chaos and bloodshed, as the dream of a freer society gave way to the harsh reality of civil war and political terror. The Russian Civil War erupted, pitting the Red Army against the White Army, and paving the way for the rise of the Soviet Union. The old world was swept away, replaced by a new regime that would shape the fate of millions for generations. Nicholas II's legacy is often remembered as one of tragic failure. He clung stubbornly to autocracy, refusing to heed the desperate calls for reform from his people and advisors. His inability to adapt sealed his fate and that of his family. Under his rule, Russia stumbled from one disaster to another. He mismanaged both war and peace, leading his nation into the catastrophe of World War I, and then signing a humiliating peace that cost Russia dearly. Nicholas's deep devotion to his family, while touching, blinded him to the political storms raging outside the palace walls. He failed to see the suffering of his people and the urgency of their demands. Yet, it would be unfair to call him a monster. He was, in many ways, a gentle and well-meaning man, but one tragically out of his depth, overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis and the rapid pace of change. He was shaped and ultimately broken by a crumbling system that could no longer support the weight of its own contradictions. Nicholas inherited a nation already in crisis, racked by poverty, unrest, and the growing anger of a people desperate for change. Surrounded by indifferent or self-serving officials, he lacked the vision, courage, and decisiveness needed to save his empire from disaster. His story stands as a powerful lesson in the dangers of inflexibility and the high cost of ignoring the need for reform. The world around him was changing rapidly, but Nicholas and his court remained trapped in the past, unable or unwilling to adapt. The fall of Nicholas II is a stark reminder that no regime, no matter how powerful, is immune to the relentless tide of history. Was he the architect of his own downfall, blinded by tradition and pride, or simply a tragic figure swept away by forces far beyond his control, caught in the storm of revolution and change? In the end, the weight of the crown and the burden of history proved far too great for one man to bear. The legacy of Nicholas II remains a cautionary tale, a story written in blood, echoing through the ages.